Hey, what's going on, guys, and welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be changing out the front diff on the JLB Cheetah and also the pinion gear inside the diff housing. So here is the front diff replacement part. There's the SKU number. There's the part number. And here's the pinion gear inside the diff housing. There's the part number. There's the SKU number. And yes, this is called a pinion gear. You can also call it a input gear or a drive gear. Basically what it does is it drives another gear, and that's basically a pinion gear. Alright, so if you guys are just changing the diff, it's really easy to do. All you gotta do is remove these two screws up here. And on the bottom of the chassis, you just remove those three screws. And once you do that, you're able to slide off this front cover, and there's the diff. You just pull it out and then put in the new diff. But what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take the whole diff case out and replace this part, which is in the back. So to take off the whole diff housing or the gearbox, you want to take off these two screws. You want to take off these two screws. You want to take off these two screws. Alright, so what I did was I took off these two screws. I took off these two screws right here, which hold the shock tower to the back of the diff housing. I took off these two screws, which hold the lower A-arm, and it also holds into the front of the diff housing. And also on the bottom, I took off the two screws in the back where my thumb is at. That holds the diff to the chassis, or the back part of the diff housing. And once you've taken all of that out, you can slide this whole diff casing off the chassis. Just like that. So now I have the whole diff casing off. And then earlier I showed you how to remove the front diff casing just to replace the diff. But I'm going to replacing the pinion gear on the inside, which I've already taken off to test this truck out on rear wheel drive, and it does pretty good on two-wheel drive. So now I'm gonna show you the old pinion gear and the new pinion gear. So here's the old pinion gear. It's pretty beat up. I'm missing a bearing, and the drive shaft cup is pretty bad. Here's the new pinion gear. It comes with two bearings, a new cup for the drive shaft, and obviously a new pinion gear and a screw that you're gonna have to lock tight. Alright, so putting this back into the diff housing, you're gonna have to remove this screw. You're gonna have to remove the pinion gear, and you're gonna have to remove one bearing. And then from here, you put that part into there, turn it around, put the bearing into place, make sure it's seated all the way in. You could even use the back part of this to push the bearing in. There you go, nice and flushed. And now you put in the pinion gear. I wish this was easier like the Maximus, where you could just push it all the way in. But once you got the pinion gear in, you put the screw. You want to start it in a little bit. Start it in a little bit, just like that. And now you want to apply some Loctite. That should be enough. And there you go. Pinion gears in. Wipe off the excess Loctite. You're basically ready to go. And then you can just put this back onto the truck or on the chassis. Alright, once you got the back part of the diff housing onto the chassis and the drive shaft is in place, you want to start with the upper control arm, and then from there you just put over the shock tower and make sure the pins, the suspension pins, are in these square part, which are the hinge pin holders. And then you want to screw in these two screws here. And then once you screwed this down, you could put in the diff, and then you could put in the CVD axles into the cups, and then you could put in the suspension hinge pin to the lower control arm, and then you could put the cover back on, and then you could screw it down. And at this point, if you want to put grease, you could put grease, but for my sake, I'm just gonna leave this dry. This is actually the third diff that's going in here, and the first diff I put grease, the second diff I put grease, and since this is the third diff, I'm gonna leave it dry, because when you get this stock from the factory, they don't put grease in here, and when you buy it a ready to run kit out of the box, they do not put grease in here. And after the experience that I've had with this, I'm starting to figure out why they don't put grease in here. So the pinion gear in the back and this gear, so regardless, no matter how long you run this, it's gonna eventually shave each other down, the tooth. So when I did put grease in here, I noticed that the grease, it did lubricate the gears, but at the same time, it was also sanding down the gears, because the grease was actually collecting all of the metal shaving particles, and when it got in between the tooth to lubricate it, it was also shaving it down, kind of like a liquid sandpaper. So I'm just gonna leave this dry the way the manufacturers made it and see how it does from there. But you guys don't have to agree with me. You guys can agree with me. Everybody's got an opinion, but this is the way I'm gonna do it. I'm not saying for you guys to not grease your gears, but yeah, this is what I'm gonna do. So, putting this cover back on, screw this down, and then this metal hinge pin plate or suspension plate, put this back on, screw this down, and then the 5 screws on the bottom, you want to screw those down, and then you should be done. So, I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to show you. Alright guys, so here it is with the new diff and new pinion gear driver set inside the diff housing. And yeah, so basically screwed this back in. I screwed these two back in, which hold the shock tower to the back of the diff case. These two screw back in to hold the front part of the diff case. These two screws back in to hold the lower control arm, and it screws into the front part of the diff case. These 5 screws on the bottom, that goes back in because it holds the whole diff housing to the chassis. And then you got to make sure that the center drive shaft is in the cup before you screw everything down, because that would really suck that you got everything in and this thing is not in. And also, I think I know why the factory included those little rubber O-rings in between here. This cup in the front and this cup back here. It's to eliminate any play in the center diff. So this thing is like solid. It's not moving anywhere. There's no play. It sounds really good. So I'm now back to 4-wheel drive. No more 2-wheel drive, even though 2-wheel drive was kind of fun. But yeah, I also, if you notice the wheelie bar, it's all the way down here now. It used to be like this high, and I noticed that on the Generation 2 wheelie bar, it's really low too, and I was able to manage and control the wheelies much better on this truck. So with this one, I decided to bring it just as low as the Generation 2, just to see if it could hold the wheelie and get some better wheelie action. But yeah, that's basically it for today, guys. So that's how you change out the front diff and the pinion gear within the diff housing. And yeah, just want to wish you guys a good day. Stay safe, like and subscribe, and as always, cheers.